Hello, welcome back to PA 605, Organizational Behavior in Government Agencies. This week, some of the topics we're going to consider are accountability, needs, resilience, technological disasters, and multi-level influences. So as I alluded to at the end of the last presentation, there is a lot of readings to cover this week. So I'll probably be dividing this into two different presentations to make it a little bit easier to digest. But there's a lot of good information, and after this, the reading load will be a little bit less. So this will be kind of the high point as far as the amount of reading for the week. But as I said, a lot of, I think, interesting information and also useful information when we're thinking about the H5N1 scenario, um, which I think at this point, as you're thinking about the H5N1 scenario, I think during week 4, we make the adjustment of now there's more person-to-person infections going on. So obviously that will create a greater level of risk and create more problems for the organization, whether you're a direct responder like a public health organization or somebody who's affected indirectly. But so keep that in mind. So as we go through, we'll be thinking about how can we relate this information to the H5N1 scenario, and also thinking in terms of Goodsell's rubric for mission mystique, because whether we're in an emergency or whether we're sort of in quote unquote normal times, which I don't know exactly what that means anymore, but when we're not under extreme duress, we would still like our organizations to be functioning as effectively as possible. So continuing to kind of keep that in the mix as well. So the first reading that we'll turn to is the Radin reading from the Accountable Juggler. And it notes that accountability is a term with numerous meanings. So, I think all of us at one point or another have been in a situation where, people have used the term accountability. So what, for our purposes, what does accountability mean? And to my mind, the thing that comes forth is the idea that whatever actions the government takes, the public has the right to ask for an explanation of those actions, or has the ability to ask for some reconsideration of those actions, or there's a mechanism to revise those actions in some way. So when I think of accountability, that's kind of what I think about is the idea that when government takes actions, the public has a right to get more information about why they took the actions, to request that something be done to revise the actions, and that there is in fact a mechanism to do that. Radin talks about in a democratic society, government institutions are answerable to the citizens. So obviously, under an ideal situation, that is true. However, it's noted that the nature of the American system is seen as creating roadblocks to accountability. And part of that is kind of the divided level of authority within the federal system to some degree. So obviously, you have the executive branch that is supposed to be responsible for managing the operations of the government and seeing that the laws are implemented. But then you also have Congress, which creates legislation, which drives policy and also funds the agencies and the public organizations. So that fragmentation between the branches can be an issue, and even fragmentation within branches. So if you look at Congress and you look at oversight of agencies like Homeland Security, there's a variety of congressional committees that can claim jurisdiction over the activities of Homeland Security. So when a situation arises, it's not entirely clear which committee is responsible. So you could have a situation where multiple committees are having hearings on effectively the same issue. And then you might have other situations where none of the committees are taking action because they're all saying, well, that's the other committee's responsibility. So it's easy to pass the buck in that kind of a situation. So there are obstacles in the way that our government is structured, which can make accountability difficult. And of course, accountability issues are also created by the fact that the members of the bureaucracy are not directly elected. They're either political appointees or they're members of the civil service. So obviously, unlike elected officials, the power of the vote doesn't come into play there. So going along with this idea of accountability, we've talked about, I think, the idea of bureaucratic discretion in the past. The idea that basically out of necessity, members of the bureaucracy historically have needed discretion because the legislation that is passed by Congress or other legislative bodies is often filled with ambiguities or just a lack of clear information about how the legislation should work in practice. So bureaucracies through the rulemaking process and other mechanisms are left to fill in those blanks. So that's something that requires bureaucratic discretion. And then when you have bureaucrats working directly in interaction with the public, police officers being one example. Police officers are considered to have a lot of bureaucratic discretion when it comes to whether to pull people over or whether to write traffic tickets, because they're dealing with the public in a lot of different scenarios, and they can't necessarily ask for advice, every time they have a question in the field. And that's true of a lot of frontline government employees in other circumstances as well. So in terms of constraints on bureaucratic discretion, there's 4 categories: legal constraints, fiscal constraints, political constraints, and efficiency expectations. So in terms of legal constraints, you have conflict of interest requirements. So one thing that is in place to basically keep bureaucrats honest and to ensure that they're making decisions based on the public interest and not on their own interest is trying to prevent them from having conflicts of interest. So, for example, if somebody is working in the agricultural bureaucracy and making rules and regulations about agribusiness interests, they shouldn't have, significant shares of an agricultural company in their investment profile and things like that. They shouldn't have a direct financial interest in the same type of industry that they're regulating. Fiscal constraints. One constraint on the bureaucracy is the fact that Congress, has control over the budget. So if Congress is displeased with the way that a public organization, a public agency is functioning, there is the potential that the budget for that agency could be reduced, or that programs could potentially be eliminated. And then from the executive standpoint, there's also the potential that the president in the implementation of policy could choose to support more some programs more than others. There was something in place at one point called the impoundment power, where presidents could decide, they weren't going to release some money that had been appropriated by Congress for particular reasons, but that impoundment authority was significantly reduced in a 1974 law due to some overreach by the Nixon administration. So the president still has some budgetary authority, but the president obviously has a lot of, aside from budgetary issues, the president has a lot of other ways that he can uh, try to hold the bureaucracy accountable through reorganization and things like that. Political constraints, talking about the interaction between interest groups and the executive and legislative branches. So if interest groups are unhappy with certain things the bureaucracy is engaged in, they can reach out to their elected officials, or they can reach out to people in the presidential administration and voice their concerns. And if those interest groups are powerful enough or influential enough, uh, action will be taken as a result of that. So that's one of the reasons why bureaucratic organizations need to be careful about managing their relationships with powerful interest groups, because if the interest groups are unhappy, that can lead to more legislative oversight, more executive oversight as well. So going back to what we were talking about sort of the Department of Agriculture and overseeing agricultural programs. So if a group like the American Farm Bureau or something like that becomes unhappy about a certain policy that's in place or the way that it's being implemented by the Department of Agriculture, they can reach out to the president or the Congress and complain about that activity. The fourth thing there is efficiency expectations, the need to balance efficiency and democratic values. And I think we've referenced this before with the reading from the Gore National Performance Review and sort of balancing red tape and the ability of government agencies to get things done. So it's just kind of reaffirming that idea that we want government to be efficient and do things in a timely manner, at the lowest possible cost. But at the same time, there have to be protections in place to make sure that no one is unfairly taking advantage of the system, and everyone, to the best of the ability of people within the bureaucracy, everyone is being treated equitably. Nobody is getting, again, special treatment or anything like that. So, government agencies are often criticized for their performance in a lot of respects, but going back to Goodsell's discussion of the case for bureaucracy and sort of his defense of bureaucracy, some of those inefficiencies are by design. Some of those inefficiencies are necessary to make sure that government is upholding constitutional values and performing due process and all of those things that are important as well. Looking at the hierarchical control of bureaucracy, this is the idea that those at the top receive authority from those with formal authority and then transmit power to those at lower levels. So, thinking about this, so, if you look at the federal bureaucracy, for example, at the top of the federal bureaucracy is the president, and then underneath the president are the members of the cabinet, and then you have sub-cabinet positions on down to the people who are dealing one-on-one with the public on a regular basis. So proponents argue that government must have the capacity to monitor and manage from the top. So there's an argument that hierarchical system is necessary for effective functioning. But others argue that government can benefit from a less formal and rigid structure. So some people have argued that there should be, maybe fewer layers within the system, or that there's more flexibility, so there's not so many divisions within agencies, and make it easier for people within organizations to sort of move from one part of the organization to the other as needed. So there's obvious, there needs to be some kind of hierarchy in place. There needs to be somebody who is ultimately accountable. And when it comes to the federal bureaucracy, that's ultimately the president should be accountable. And the same is true. If you're looking at the state level, the chief executive, the governor is accountable. If you're looking at the local level, the mayor it should be accountable. And then there needs to be, obviously some other layers of accountability in there as well. The chief executives can't be expected to be supervising the day-to-day operations, the day-to-day interactions between the public and employees. So there does need to be some hierarchy, but there's certainly been some arguments in the public administration literature for more kind of horizontal systems, for horizontal systems to be in place, less of a rigid structure, again, allowing for more flexibility of movement of employees from one part of the organization to the other. The other is making sure that there's not too many layers of management involved. We talked about Gulick earlier, and we talked about the idea of Posdekor, but one thing we didn't talk about was the idea of span of control, which is an important concept to consider as well. The idea that you don't want there to be so many layers between the person who's ultimately responsible for the organization and the people who are performing the work. If there's too many layers, or if there's unnecessary layers, that creates problems for accountability, but it also creates problems for communication. If there are things that are wrong that need to be addressed, those problems have to go through so many layers of bureaucracy that it never really ever reaches the top, and therefore never gets acted upon. So you want to make sure that the span of control is appropriate, so that necessary change can be made, and the person at the very top is not too isolated from what's going on. Another set of ideas about accountability comes from Romzek and Dubnik, and this is a reading that I used to assign. I haven't assigned it this semester. But they do have some of their own ideas about accountability, which I think are worth mentioning. Hierarchical accountability, again, the idea that people within an organization should be obedient to organizational directives. So those directives should be communicated from the people at the top and then disseminate down throughout the organization. So that kind of goes back to Goodsell's idea of mission mystique, and the idea of a mission that is communicated throughout the organization. Organizational directives should come from the mission of the organization and should be communicated down the line and clearly understood. And if that mission and those directives are communicated clearly and people are not following those directives, then obviously they need to be held accountable for that. Legal accountability, external sources exercise control and scrutiny. So obviously, there's the idea that if public agencies do something wrong, you can take them to court, or you can use quasi-judicial proceedings to try to get the agencies to revoke a decision or to revoke an action or to get something adjusted. So there's different mechanisms in place where you can try to exert that legal accountability. But it's the idea that if an agency or a person or people within a public organization go outside the boundaries of what is legally or constitutionally appropriate, there should be mechanisms in place to address that. And part of that is the idea that there should be due process before some organizational actions. So if somebody is receiving a government benefit and that benefit is going to be taken away, giving them an opportunity to have a hearing so that they can make their case for why they should continue to receive that benefit, and make the government explain why that benefit's being taken away. So part of it can be after the fact, after the government's taken an action, that issue can be addressed legally. But legal accountability can also come into play before the government acts by due process kinds of procedures. Professional accountability, low levels of control, high degree of discretion. So it's basically the idea that professionals will police themselves, that the managers within government organizations are expected to be governed by professional norms. So kind of going along with that, there was a statement that came out today from the American Society of Public Administration about government employees sort of reacting to the Trump administration's actions. A certain percentage of federal employees have been fired or are being fired. Others are being sort of offered a buyout. And some of them are being locked out of certain parts of the organization, and certain programs are expected to go away. So the organization put out a statement and said that people should continue to stay in their positions and to the best of their ability, carry out their responsibilities, carry out their constitutional duties, and stay within the code of ethics that ASPA puts out. So the idea that even though these are difficult times for a lot of federal employees, that they should continue to do their job, should continue to try to serve the public to the best of their ability, and not be dissuaded by some of the recent activity. So you could see that as kind of an idea of professional accountability, maintaining professional norms. Obviously, maintaining standards of honesty, making appropriate use of government monies, not engaging in corrupt practices or not misusing public funds, not abusing your position for personal gain, those kinds of issues that would be covered under like the Hatch Act and some other laws. So the degree to which professional norms or professional accountability works is really based on the degree to which people get a sense of esteem from their position, and the degree to which how they're perceived by other people in their profession affects their views of themselves. So if you're someone who takes a great deal of pride in being a government employee, if that gives you, going back to, again, Goodsell, talking about that idea of intrinsic motivation. If you're a government employee who has intrinsic motivation and you get a lot of self-esteem from your work and the position that you hold, you're more likely to uphold that professional accountability. If the way you are viewed by other people in your organization or other people in government means a lot to you, you're more likely to abide by those professional norms. But if you're more motivated by personal interests or financial interests or what have you, you might be more inclined to violate some of those professional norms. So again, it's perceived as often having a low level of control and a high degree of discretion, because it's ultimately up to the individual how much influence professional accountability has. And then political accountability, and that's perceived as having low levels of direct control. Managers may choose whether to respond to the concerns of external stakeholders. So we talked about the idea of interest groups and interest groups, becoming displeased with different decisions an agency might make, or different programs they could implement, or funding cuts or something like that. Easy. So, obviously those internal, or I should say external stakeholders, we use the example of the American Farm Bureau, or you could look at it from the education side and look at teachers unions, or you could look at medical organizations like the American Medical Association. But whatever organization you're focused on, those organizations may approach the bureaucracy and ask them to take certain actions, and the bureaucracy can basically decide how much weight they're going to give to those different excuse me, how much weight they're going to give to those different stakeholders. So this is classified as having a low level of direct control, because obviously the interest groups, these external actors, don't have direct authority to take action against the bureaucracy. However, we did mention earlier that if the interest groups have a high degree of connection with elected officials, members of Congress, people within the executive branch, then that interest group influence can translate into more direct action potentially. So Ramsuk and Dubnyk say that agencies usually function under one or two types of accountability in this system, and occasionally all of these types of accountability are in effect. So reasons for shifts in organizational structure. So we talked about the idea of, one of the approaches to accountability, or one of the things that can be used for accountability purposes is reorganization, kind of shifting the structure of an organization to make it more efficient, make it more effective, make it more in line with what uh, the president wants or Congress wants. So some of these reasons for engaging in these kinds of changes are interrelationships between management and policy. So if a particular policy area is seen as being more relevant to a different unit of the bureaucracy, then it can be shifted. Um, so, for example, and I may be switching this a little bit, but the Strategic National Stockpile, which is the stockpile of vaccines and other medical resources that the government has in the case of a medical emergency, that was under the control of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, for a period of time. And then it was decided by people in government, presumably, I think in the executive branch, Department of Health and Human Services, it made more sense to put it under the control of the ASPR, the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, which is a different unit in HHS, because the ASPR position is more directly involved with responding to emergencies. So from a policy perspective, it made sense to move it into a different area of management. Increased public expectations. So if there's more public demand for services, that can result in potentially an agency within a larger department sort of being spun off into its own department. and other types of changes to the organizational structure. So if you look at, after 9/11, with, increased concerns about terrorism and increased demands for better homeland security, it was decided that the existing federal structure wasn't sufficient, that there needed to be a special department created to specifically focus on homeland security issues. And similarly, with the intelligence community, the creation of a director of national intelligence to kind of oversee the Central Intelligence Agency and all of the other intelligence agencies within the federal bureaucracy. Movement toward decentralization. So the idea that the government should be more decentralized, that either more federal authority should devolve down to the state and local level, or more work should be contracted out to nonprofit organizations or for-profit organizations. So that that kind of movement is going to result in changes to the organizational structure, potentially downsizing some organizations or distributing their responsibilities across other departments or other agencies. For example, there's been some discussion recently about doing away with the Federal Department of Education and distributing some of the policy responsibilities currently held by the Department of Education to other federal departments, as well as to state and local governments. So that's just one sort of theoretical example. Appreciation for the use of multiple administrative strategies. So again, the idea that you might see some situations that need a more hierarchical system. There might be others where a more horizontal system is appropriate. So just recognizing that not every federal or state or local organization needs to have the same type of structure. That for certain types of organization, it may make more sense to have a looser structure. You could argue with, for example, emergency management kinds of agencies, that it makes more sense to have a looser, kind of more decentralized kind of model, from the standpoint that you oftentimes when you're dealing with an emergency, there's a need for collaboration between the federal, state, and local government, and involving nonprofit organizations and other stakeholders in there. So having a very rigid system doesn't really make a lot of sense. Whereas with other organizations, take for example the military, a hierarchy is more necessary in those situations. Less reliance on the federal government to provide resources. So, there's been some discussion again lately coming from the Trump administration about the degree to which the federal government should be responsible for emergency response in situations like the California wildfires and things like that. So if that is translated into actual policy, and FEMA is, the funding is cut, or FEMA is reorganized, or if FEMA were to even be eliminated and potentially replaced with something else, obviously that would involve restructuring at the federal level, but it would also require restructuring at the state and local level. You better be able to accommodate emergency management kinds of needs. So that would be a situation where there would be not only reorganization at the federal level, but reorganization down the line. And that kind of gets into that next point, more reliance on state government, local governments, and nonprofits. And there's been a movement, definitely since the 1980s, for more federal responsibilities to be transferred down to the state level and the local level, and even nonprofit organizations and faith-based organizations. So that's a trend or an idea that's been implemented, throughout the decades, and I think is definitely going to come into play with initiatives coming out of the Trump administration, which is obviously again going to necessitate a pretty substantial reorganization at the federal level if it happens. And then the state and local governments and nonprofit organizations are going to have to figure out how are they going to best configure themselves to be able to meet these new responsibilities. Increased controversy over programs. So if a particular program falls out of favor, that can result in a change in organizational structure. There was a news article today that I was looking at about USAID and the potential that the U.S. Agency for International Development may end up being eliminated, due to some controversy surrounding some of their programs or their work. So, that agency oversees, I think, the lion's share of humanitarian funding that the U.S. engages in around the world. So, assuming that we're not going to completely cut off humanitarian funding around the world, if USAID does in fact go away because of this controversy, then it's going to require, again, other agencies to sort of pick up the slack and that work to be divided into other parts of the bureaucracy. Increased networking. So the fact that government is becoming increasingly networked, either networked, between the federal, state, and local levels, or networked between the government and for-profit, or the government and not-for-profit organizations. But again, kind of as that networking occurs, you see more of these kind of horizontal relationships, in the sense that the government and nonprofit organizations are working together, but the government is not necessarily in a position to give orders per se to the nonprofit organization. If the federal government's providing funding, they can dictate certain things as a condition of receiving that funding, but it's not like the nonprofit isn't under the direct authority of the government. And by that same token, with for-profit companies, the government is networking with them, contracting out for different goods and services. But that doesn't mean that the government has the authority to give direct orders to the different organizations. So, communication advances. And this is, kind of becoming kind of a controversial thing from the standpoint of, with the COVID-19 pandemic and people moving to telework and work from home, and organizations actually found that it worked better than perhaps some people anticipated, and maybe it made sense for some government employees to work from home, saving them a commute and reducing stress and things like that. Now you have sort of a rescinding, at least at the federal level, of telework and working from home. But with those communication advances, with teleconferences, with Zoom, and all of these different mechanisms, it allows for a situation where you don't necessarily need these big sort of centralized offices where all the employees are all in the same place at the same time on a daily basis. You can have more situations where people can work from other locations and not have to sit in rush hour traffic and things like that, and maybe have a little bit better work-life balance. But again, that idea of telework is kind of under attack at this point at the federal level, and in some state governments as well, with elected officials saying they want to move back to a more traditional office environment. So all of these together cause managers to feel a piling of expectations. So when you've got all these different forces working together at the same time, um, it can be a lot for managers to kind of deal with because there's a lot of contradictions in here, and there's a lot of different stakeholders that you need to try to appease. But these are the kinds of considerations and responsibilities that managers have to be cognizant of to keep elected officials relatively happy, keep powerful interests relatively happy, those sorts of things. Juggling expectations, kind of going along with that idea that managers are having to be cognizant of multiple different, sometimes conflicting things at the same time. Policy expectations, political expectations, and then management and internal process. So policy expectations includes the success of a program depending on the policy context in which it operates. So if you're in charge of, as a manager, if you're in charge of implementing a policy that is popular with the people, um, that's going to facilitate an easier implementation process. If you're dealing with a program that is unpopular with the majority, that's going to make implementation more difficult. So if you look, back in time to the Obama administration with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, there was a lot of political partisan division over that policy. Um, Through most of the Obama administration, that policy was majority unpopular. And there were challenges that were created by that. There were people that should have signed up for coverage under the Affordable Care Act that didn't sign up for political reasons, and there were states that didn't want to participate in certain aspects of the program, particularly the Medicaid expansion. So when you're kind of fighting against the tide and you're fighting against sort of popular opinion, that's going to create a lot of challenges for that policy. Political expectations. We've talked about the executive, the legislative interest groups, and sort of the competing input that you can get. Obviously, from the executive and legislative perspective, if you have a situation like we have now, where the president, the president and the Congress are controlled by the same political party, there's not usually not as much division or differences there. And the interest groups that are being listened to are typically interest groups that are in line with, in this case, the conservative or Republican interests. If you have a situation where the presidency or the executive is controlled by one party and the legislature is controlled by another party, then that makes it more challenging because you have different ideologies you have to try to address, and some interest groups are going to be powerful with the Congress and some interest groups are going to be powerful with the president. So balancing those interest groups as well. So being mindful of that. And then management and internal process. We've talked about centralization versus decentralization. How much, what balance is appropriate. If things are too decentralized, it can make it harder to maintain a system of accountability and control, obviously. But if things are too centralized, then potentially, it makes it difficult to actually deal with problems. And again, going back to the emergency management kind of perspective, if things are too centralized with emergency management, with Homeland Security and things like that, you may be missing important local knowledge or on the ground information. Your perspective can be so sort of focused on what's going on in headquarters and kind of what's going on with just the picture that you have of the situation, that you're not seeing the complete picture with what's going on the ground. And then budgeting, obviously, maintaining, effective stewardship of the budget, making sure that money is being used appropriately, and you're keeping a proper account of the outcomes from that budgeting. So the next thing we're going to talk about, so we're shifting gears from the Radin reading and focusing in on the Maslow reading. So Maslow talks about this idea of the hierarchy of needs, which is an idea that I'm sure many of you have encountered probably a few times in different classes if you've taken psychology classes or other classes dealing with organizational performance. Maslow's hierarchy of needs comes up a lot in a variety of contexts. But it's basically the idea of, how does a person move from a state of meeting their physiological needs to self-actualize. And we'll talk about kind of that pyramid in a second. But thinking about, with lower level employees, there's an expectation that lower level employees in an organization are more concerned with material and security. They have material needs. They've got to pay their bills. They've got to pay their rent or their mortgage. They have to pay fees associated with their kids if they have kids in school and things like that. And they want to have security. They want to have the sense that the job is going to be there for the long term. As long as they're doing a good job, they're going to continue to hold that position. Obviously, with what's going on at the federal level right now, the level of employment security there is a lot more limited than it was a few weeks ago. But there's that expectation that lower level employees are more concerned with money and benefits and making sure that they have a job for the long term. Whereas higher level employees, because they're paid better and they probably have more experience and more sort of capital built up within the organization, they're not worried about losing their job because they're better off. They're not concerned about the material and the security interests. So they have more freedom to be focused on achievement and challenge. So that may mean they move into different positions. They kind of advance up the line, take on, higher level responsibilities. So if you kind of think about this from a university perspective, if you focus at the university level with faculty, you have an assistant professor coming in and they're primarily concerned with, making sure they have enough money to meet their needs and trying to keep their job. And the same could be said of people who are at the staff level as well. They're concerned about meeting their financial needs and they're concerned about doing a good job within whatever department they're in so they can keep their position. Whereas, if you look at people in higher level administrative kinds of positions, like administrative vice presidents and deans and provosts and things like that, a lot of times you'll see people transferring to different institutions, leaving one institution and going to another to take on higher level positions. So moving from a provost job to a president's job at a university, because they're interested in that achievement and they're interested in taking on new challenges. They've risen through the ranks in terms of being a faculty member and being part of the administration, and they want to sort of maximize their utility, maximize not only how much they can get paid and things like that, but how to what degree can they be effective in these higher positions. So that would be the idea of self-actualizing. Self-actualizing is that idea of, how can I sort of rise to a position in whatever profession or type of activity I'm interested in, where I feel like I've maximized my utility in that area. So this is a graphic of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So he talked about it being kind of a pyramid or hierarchy. So you have the physiological needs at the bottom, and that's not to say that physiological needs are not important, but that's to say that physiological needs are foundational. So if you're in a situation where you don't have access to food on a regular basis, you don't have access to clean water, you don't have access to quality shelter, um, obviously if you're dealing with a situation where the air quality is poor, which is certainly a problem with uh, California right now with the wildfires, um, and reproduction is put in there as well, sort of, from a family perspective. um, if you're wanting to start a family and you can't, that obviously creates a lot of stress as well. Um, so assuming those needs are all met, then you move on to the safety needs, which would be, can I keep my job? Um, can I buy a house? Um, you know, working out or dieting to improve health, trying to accumulate more resources, putting in a security system in your house or something like that. Um, doing what you feel is necessary to maintain your physical safety, your economic safety, and so forth. And then assuming that second level is met, then according to this hierarchy, you move up into love and belonging. You try to maintain the friendships that you already have. You try to build up new friendships. Uh, build good relationships with your family. If you're not married or in a regular relationship, you try to start a relationship. Um, but overall, it's having a sense of connection. You want to have a sense of connection with friends, with family, with significant others. And then esteem, would grow out of that previous level. If you have people who love you and that you feel connected with, you're more likely to have a sense of self-esteem. You have a sense of status, at least among your friend group and your family. You feel recognized for who you are, um, and you take a certain level of self-respect from that. If you've got a good friend group, if you've got a good family backing you up, then that gives you a sense of, I'm a person who deserves to be respected. I'm a person who deserves to be loved, and then that gets you uh, potentially to self-actualization, which is the idea of becoming the most that one can be. So that can be, professional self-actualization, which we were talking about with the idea of advancing, in your profession, moving from sort of the assistant professor to the president of a university. But it doesn't necessarily even have to be professional. It doesn't necessarily have to be job related. You could be an artist, and trying to get to the point where you self-actualize as an artist, whether it's painting or photography or what have you, and just develop that skill to the best that you possibly can. So it could be something that's part of your job, or it could be something outside of that. But whatever it is that you seek to become the best at, or the best that you can be at, that's where self-actualization comes into play. So if we're thinking about this from the governmental perspective, again, kind of going back to Gore and the National Performance Review, I think Gore and the people who engaged in that review would argue that part of the issue with the federal government at that time, and it's probably still true today, there's too many people who are focused on rules and regulations and staying within those rules and regulations, as opposed to self-actualizing and being creative and being innovative and doing the job the best that they can, because people feel so constrained by those rules and regulations that they don't take risks, they don't take chances. And I think that one thing that's required in terms of being able to achieve self-actualization is being willing to take risks, um, and to sort of go against the conventional wisdom in some situations. And again, going back to Goodsell's rubric and thinking about intrinsic motivation, you want people who are in government positions or nonprofit positions who get a sense of self-esteem from their positions, who feel a sense of belonging. And obviously, those positions do need to meet their safety needs and their physiological needs. And you hope that if they can meet those four levels, eventually people will self-actualize within government. And part of that is contestation, being able to engage in contestation and opposition. If you're part of an organization and you see problems in that organization, but you don't feel like you have a voice and you don't feel like anything ever changes, it's highly unlikely you're going to be able to self-actualize within that organization. Eventually you're going to start to feel trapped. And feeling trapped is the exact opposite of what you would want in a mission mystique kind of organization. So you have to be mindful of that as well. So kind of taking a broad perspective, we've covered the Maslow reading and the Radin reading on the accountable juggler. So thinking about this in the H5N1 scenario in terms of accountability, obviously we whether you're working in a public organization or a nonprofit organization, you want the federal government in general to be accountable for their management of the H1N1 situations. You want them to be accountable for providing regular high quality information so people can make their own choices about what they should do and what they shouldn't do, and organizations can make those decisions about what they should do or should not do. And then engaging in proper diagnostic surveillance kinds of activities. So doing, the things that the federal government and state governments were doing during COVID, and recognizing that there were a lot of weaknesses in that response, but the type of tasks that were engaged in during the COVID-19 pandemic and previous emergencies. So from an accountability perspective, you want the federal government doing what it needs to do. And then if you're working, for example, in a state or local level organization, you're going to be held accountable for being able to keep up your performance during this outbreak as well. So even if you're experiencing challenges, whether it's an increased caseload or a loss of personnel due to people getting sick or some combination of the two, people are still going to expect you to do your job. Some people, have focused on, like, for example, the Department of Child and Family Services and things like that. Those types of organizations are going to be expected to continue to function even in the situation. So how can you maintain that? You're going to be held responsible, so you have to have some plan in place for how you're going to keep those operations going, even in sort of dangerous situations. So you're going to be experiencing your own accountability expectations. And looking at it from sort of the, managing sort of the political side of things, how are you going to maintain good relations with different interests? Obviously, if you're talking about milk testing and things like that, there's going to be some business interests that are unhappy with that. If there's public health infection control measures that have to be put into place, some organizations are going to be upset about that. So how are you going to manage kind of the politics of it? How are you going back to, from a policy perspective, how are you going to operate again, if you're putting in place public health infection control policies, which we saw during COVID-19, had a lot of pushback. How are you going to try to encourage the public to get on board with some potential restrictions on their behavior? How are you going to manage if you have a limited budget to respond to these? We've seen during previous responses, like especially with the Zika situation in 2016, there were sort of limitations on budgeting because Congress was slow to grant an appropriation for Zika. So state and local governments kind of had to manage on their own. And then, managing the relationship between the federal government and the state and local governments, what should be federal responsibility, what should be state and local responsibility. So thinking about those kinds of issues as well. Again, thinking about sort of the hierarchy and, again, is this something where it should be a very vertical kind of hierarchical response, or would it make more sense to be more horizontal and to have a more co-equal relationship among different stakeholders? And of course, there's going to be constraints. There's going to be legal constraints. So there's a possibility that actions that you take could be challenged in court. There's going to be fiscal constraints, as there often is in government or the nonprofit sector. You may feel political constraints in terms of what you can and can't recommend. If you're looking at instituting mask mandates, some places mask mandates are going to be fine with politicians and the general public. Other places they're not. And then how are you going to balance being able to take these kinds of actions while at the same time being respectful of democratic norms and kind of the perspective that people's individual liberty is being threatened. You'll have to keep those kinds of considerations in mind as well. So I think we're about at an hour, a little over an hour at this point. So I think we'll stop there for part one, and then we'll pick up with part two and talk about the remaining readings. So I hope you found this discussion useful, and let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you for part two.